When President Trump imposed his tariffs, Canada responded aggressively with clear and immediate countermeasures. The 25% tariffs on U.S. goods were not just about retaliation. They were a defense of Canadian sovereignty, an assertion that Canada would not allow unilateral trade decisions to harm its economy without consequences. By targeting key industries like energy, automotive, and agriculture, Canada sent a powerful message that it would not be bullied. On the other hand, Mexico's response was less confrontational. While Mexico, under President Claudia Sheinbaum, was also negatively impacted by the tariffs, it chose a more diplomatic approach. Rather than impose retaliatory tariffs, Mexico focused on negotiating behind closed doors and working to maintain stability in its trade relationship with the U.S. Mexico's strategy was one of quiet diplomacy, avoiding the direct economic clashes Canada embraced. While Canada stood firm, asserting its economic power with retaliatory tariffs, Mexico opted to de-escalate tensions by offering private talks to find a resolution. This difference in approaches illustrates how two neighboring countries, both affected by U.S. tariffs, chose dramatically different paths. But Canada's bold move wasn't just about economics, it was a defense of sovereignty and national pride. Canadians rallied behind their government, with many choosing made-in-Canada products over American alternatives. The message was clear: Canada would not back down. A recent Angus Reid Institute survey reveals that 55% of Canadians feel angry, 37% feel betrayed, and 29% feel anxious about the impending U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods. This collective sentiment has galvanized a nationwide movement to support domestic products, reflecting a robust shift toward economic nationalism. South of the border, the American public's reaction to Canada's retaliatory measures has been marked by growing concern and skepticism. A recent Harris poll indicates that 72% of Americans are worried about the tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump, up from 61% in January. Despite the administration's assurances that these measures will benefit the U.S. economy, 66% believe that economic recovery from these policies will take years. Because of this, Canadians believe newly elected Prime Minister Carney brings a wealth of experience from his tenure as the Governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. His leadership is expected to play a pivotal role in navigating the current trade tensions with the United States. In his acceptance speech, Carney addressed the challenges posed by U.S. tariffs, stating that President Trump's actions aim to weaken the Canadian economy with unjustified tariffs. He warned about dark days ahead due to these U.S. measures and emphasized Canada's readiness to confront these challenges, asserting that, in trade, as in hockey, Canada will win. As Canada unveiled its countermeasures, the economic impact began to ripple through the United States. The U.S. stock market reacted almost instantly. The S&P 500 plunged by nearly 1.5% from its February highs within days as investors braced for a prolonged trade conflict. Analysts projected that U.S. GDP growth for the first quarter of 2025 could decline 1.7% from 2.1%. These projections were alarming. If the trade war persisted, U.S. consumers might face an annual cost increase of over $1,200 per household. The repercussions for American manufacturers were immediate and severe. Companies that rely on imported steel, aluminum, and even electricity from Canada now face sharply higher input costs. For instance, an automotive assembly plant in Michigan, which sources roughly 30% of its materials from Canada, might see production costs rise by as much as $4,500 per vehicle. With nearly 17 million vehicles sold in 2023, this surge in costs poses a significant challenge and is likely to be passed on to consumers, increasing vehicle prices substantially. In addition to manufacturing, the energy sector is under strain. Ontario, a critical hub for Canadian energy exports, has imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity shipments destined for U.S. states such as New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. Recent data suggests that this surcharge could raise electricity prices by up to 15% in affected regions. Given that Canada supplies about 60% of U.S. oil imports and nearly 70% of U.S. refineries rely on Canadian crude, these measures may drive gasoline prices up by as much as 50 cents per gallon in the Midwest. Internationally, Canada's public retaliation marks a dramatic shift in trade policy. Unlike Mexico, whose response was more discreet and involved behind-the-scenes negotiations, Canada's leadership chose a confrontational public approach. Trudeau's government announced retaliatory tariffs that target a wide array of U.S. goods, including household appliances, auto parts, and consumer products. Approximately 75% of Canadian exports are destined for the U.S. market. Thus, any sustained reduction in American demand could have a crippling effect on the Canadian economy. Recent estimates from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce warn that if these tariffs persist, Canadian GDP growth could decline by as much as 2.6% annually over the next 2 years, with unemployment potentially rising by 0.8 percentage points. These economic shifts have significant implications for global trade. For decades, free trade has been the cornerstone of international economic policy. The unilateral imposition of tariffs, combined with aggressive immigration enforcement, represents a fundamental departure from that model. Global supply chains, which have become deeply integrated, are now at risk of being reconfigured. A study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated that global supply chain efficiency could decline by 4% over the next 5 years, potentially slowing global economic growth by 0.5% to 1% annually. This evolving landscape affects everyday consumers on both sides of the border. American households could see their annual expenses rise by over $1,200 due to higher prices on imported goods such as electronics, vehicles, and basic household items. Similarly, Canadian consumers, long accustomed to competitively priced American products, may soon face higher costs and reduced availability. For businesses, the trade war introduces significant operational challenges. Companies that once enjoyed seamless cross-border supply chains now must reconfigure logistics and sourcing strategies. A Bloomberg report found that nearly 47% of U.S. companies expect production costs to rise by 8% or more in the coming year, a change that could squeeze profit margins and curtail expansion plans. The energy sector is also bracing for challenges. With Ontario's electricity surcharge expected to increase industrial electricity costs by an average of 12% in the Midwest, industries reliant on stable power supplies, such as manufacturing and technology, will face rising production expenses. Diplomatically, the conflict is prompting nations worldwide to reconsider their trade policies. Canada's public retaliation, in contrast to Mexico's more reserved approach, sets a precedent for handling trade disputes. If other nations follow Canada's lead, we could witness a broader shift toward protectionism. A recent OECD report noted that if such measures become widespread, global trade growth could slow by as much as 0.4 percentage points annually, undermining decades of progress in international economic cooperation. However, the economic dimensions of this trade war extend well beyond tariffs alone. Trump's aggressive stance on trade has become deeply intertwined with his hardline domestic policies, especially on immigration and border security. CNN has reported several developments that further illustrate this broader strategy. On March 17, 2025, a federal judge issued a court order mandating the deportation of a group of Venezuelan nationals using the Alien Enemies Act, a measure intended to expedite removals and secure American borders. This decision was framed as necessary to stem the flow of illicit drugs and to counter what Trump described as a flood of illegal migrants and contraband. Just 1 day earlier, CNN detailed that the Trump administration had been aggressively deporting individuals under the Alien Enemies Act. Deportation orders increased by 40% in March 2025 compared to the previous quarter, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection data. Video coverage from March 18th featured legal commentary from Justice Roberts, who questioned the broad application of these policies, highlighting a growing controversy over due process and civil rights. Adding further complexity, a CNN report from January 29, 2025, highlighted violent activities linked to a Venezuelan gang associated with the Tren de Aragua. This group has been implicated in drug trafficking and violent crime, and U.S. officials cited its rise as justification for stricter border enforcement. These immigration and deportation policies, combined with aggressive tariffs, are central to Trump's America First agenda, which aims to reassert U.S. dominance both economically and at the border. The convergence of these trade and immigration policies illustrates a broader strategy. Trump's use of tariffs and the Alien Enemies Act to expedite deportations is part of an America First approach that seeks to reassert U.S. control over both its borders and trade relations. For instance, U.S. Customs reported that in March 2025, over 3,200 individuals were deported under the expanded provisions of the Alien Enemies Act, while violent criminal activity linked to Venezuelan gangs increased by 25% over the past year. Additionally, a Pew Research Center survey found that 73% of Americans believe current immigration policies are too harsh, reflecting a deep societal divide. As high-level negotiations continue, recent phone calls between President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau have underscored the urgency of the situation. Trudeau warned that if the U.S. persists with its unilateral actions, Canada might be forced to reduce its reliance on the U.S. market by up to 15% over the next 2 years, a significant shift considering that 75% of Canadian exports currently flow to the United States. The broader implications are profound. On one level, this trade war represents a clash between a protectionist approach and a long-standing commitment to free trade. Trump's policies, which combine steep tariffs with aggressive deportation measures, are central to his America First strategy. In contrast, Canada's response, marked by bold public actions and a determination to diversify its trade relationships, reflects a commitment to defending national sovereignty and economic interests. For global markets, uncertainty is becoming the norm. A recent survey by the Peterson Institute found that 53% of U.S. companies plan to reconfigure their supply chains within 12 months to reduce reliance on Canadian inputs, while nearly 60% of Canadian firms are seeking new markets in Europe and Asia. This realignment could have lasting implications, potentially reducing global supply chain efficiency by 4% over the next 5 years. Everyday consumers are also feeling the impact. Retail analysts predict that prices for basic goods could rise by 3 to 5% over the next year. For example, the average price of a mid-range vehicle in the U.S. could increase by up to $5,000, while food prices may experience an annual inflation rate of around 4%. These increases place additional pressure on household budgets, particularly in an economy where wage growth remains modest. On the international front, these policy measures are reshaping global trade dynamics. Canada's bold public retaliation, as opposed to Mexico's reserved response, sets a precedent that may embolden other nations to adopt similar measures. This could lead to a more fragmented global trading system where unilateral tariffs become the norm rather than the exception, an outcome that would undermine decades of trade liberalization and economic cooperation. In conclusion, the trade war sparked by Canada's $30 billion retaliation is not just an economic dispute. It is a comprehensive confrontation spanning trade, immigration, and national security. Canada's decision to stand up to U.S. tariffs represents a bold assertion of national sovereignty, while Trump's aggressive policies, combining steep tariffs with controversial deportation measures, embody an uncompromising America First strategy that is reshaping both domestic and international economic policies. The stakes could not be higher. With U.S. GDP growth forecasted to dip by nearly 3% in the coming quarter, Canadian export reliance on the U.S. potentially reduced by up to 15%, and global supply chain efficiency at risk of declining by 4% over the next 5 years, the consequences of this conflict will be felt across the board. As both nations, and indeed the world, grapple with these challenges, the decisions made in the coming months will redefine the economic landscape of North America and may set a new precedent for global trade relations. In summary, Canada's bold $30 billion retaliatory tariffs and aggressive stance in the face of President Trump's protectionist measures have not only disrupted the deeply integrated North American trade system, but also exposed the vulnerabilities in U.S. manufacturing, energy, and consumer markets. We've seen U.S. stock indices plunge by over 5.5%, production costs surge, adding up to $4,500 per vehicle in some cases, and forecasts warn of a nearly 3% decline in U.S. GDP growth in the first quarter of 2025. At the same time, controversial domestic policies, including the expedited deportations under the Alien Enemies Act and stricter border enforcement, reveal a broader America First agenda that intertwines trade with national security. This high-stakes confrontation isn't just about numbers. It's about national sovereignty, economic resilience, and the future of global trade. Canada's decision to publicly and forcefully retaliate sends a clear message. Economic fairness and respect in trade relations are non-negotiable. As businesses reconfigure supply chains and consumers brace for higher prices, the long-term consequences of this conflict may redefine not only North American economic policies, but also set a precedent for how trade disputes are managed worldwide. If you found this analysis insightful, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our continuing coverage of this evolving trade war. We invite you to join the conversation. Share your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Stay tuned for more in-depth updates on how these developments impact industries, economies, and everyday lives on both sides of the border.